But there is one thing that has caused me to, and I'm sure like you, yell at the television how many times over the past 5 weeks? It has been a bad summer for parts of the activist media. A very bad summer, because they wanted to use other people's tragedy to make their political point. Anything, everything was a way of exacting revenge for the election last year, to demanding that Australia should be much more like a Greens utopia than the reality of what we are when it comes to producing the pollution that leads to man-made climate change. Now, no doubt Media Watch will be getting ready with its 700 producers when it returns on the ABC to largely have a go at the company that I work for. So let's mention the very bad summer that the media had that I'm pretty sure Media Watch will ignore. It begins with Channel 2. The taxpayer-funded television and radio stations that were operating around Gippsland in Victoria that has been ravaged by the fires. Well, they deleted a Facebook post during the fires that showed that there were people who were protesting against hazard reduction burns that took place, that were planned to take place before this summer season. Will Paul Barry have a second or two to mention how over at SBS they were in the deleting game too, because they had a story that said that a climate expert suggested that climate change and bushfires are not automatically linked. That story was deleted and then rewritten and then reposted to fit the narrative. There's our mates over at The Project who, well, they claim didn't hear what was going on, but they knew exactly what they were doing when they decided to feed into the "it's all ScoMo's fault." And I'll get to that in a second. It's all ScoMo's fault. And something that was trending on Twitter for all the people who hate Scott Morrison and have always hated Scott Morrison, they say #NotMyPM. So when a nice little old lady who looks like a Liberal voter, because aren't all little old ladies Liberal voters? Well, when she uses a hashtag, bang, it's our story. This is what went to air on The Project.
Jackie, this is the Prime Minister. It's not my problem.
That's it. Hand in your gun and badge, ScoMo. It's done. The Quiet Australians have spoken. The miracle win is invalid. All over. Except for the fact that the reason she said, "Not my Prime Minister," is because as the tape that Channel 10 had, the tape that Channel 10 chose not to use, showed the nice little old lady is a British citizen.
Jackie, this is the Prime Minister.
It's not my problem. I'm not resident. Where are you living?
Well, of course they say it was all just a misunderstanding. That's generally how fake news can be explained away, right? Then, of course, because it was the Get ScoMo narrative, you see, there were only two things that were really at play. One, volunteers are awesome. Two, Prime Minister is to blame for everything. And this was exactly the same media who hated him all the way through last year, who prayed that he would have been blown away at the election, but that's yesterday's news. So they were using anything they could possibly do to show that Australia had turned on this bloke, that we were done. And if it wasn't the little old lady, it was the people who yelled at him when he went to the fire grounds on the south coast of New South Wales. "You should be ashamed of yourself." Well, let's have a look at these traditional Liberal voters and the ones who were actually yelling at him. They look like, card-carrying members, don't you think? What about the other bloke with the mohawk? Yep, that's a Quiet Australian if ever I've seen one. This is when they use anything they can, the media, to fit their narrative, to shove it into the machine. The clickbait and beat-up media were out of control this summer. They were essentially unchallenged, and thank God for Chris Smith here on Sky News and Tim Blair at the Daily Telegraph, along with a few other good souls on Talkback Radio around the country. But the pushback is well and truly on now, because normal people were being fed this diet, this endless diet of hate and beat-up, of sensationalism and screaming, about trying to pretend that the Prime Minister is individually in charge of not only how to respond to every single fire, but he's probably responsible for starting them in the first place. Now, my favourite example, by the way, of how the rules changed during this fire season was news.com.au have always hated Tony Abbott. They have ripped and teared at him for the entirety of the time that it has been a website, and certainly when he was Prime Minister. They hounded him when he was an MP, and they cheered when he had left the Parliament. You may remember this as one of their many clickbait and beat-up headlines, where Tony Abbott now has a sad new life. They even mocked him, and remember, plenty in the media did mock Tony Abbott when he got a medal for decades of service to the Rural Fire Service on the same day as International Women's Day. Apparently this was disrespectful a few years ago, but that narrative changed because, you see, he's not ScoMo. So it was on your Abbott. It only took them this for them to turn around and realise how good a bloke he is. We'll get to the current member for Warringah in a second. While the former was fighting fires, she was tweeting. Oh yeah, there was a ghost sighting, and there were lots of them, including, unsurprisingly, in a piece that he was able to write for The Guardian. The bloke he got rid of as Prime Minister was fighting fires. This bloke was writing pieces for The Guardian. Geez, I wonder why it didn't work out for the ghost. Oh yeah, and then, well, as I said about Zali, while Tony Abbott was fighting fires, she said, everyone should resign. Everyone has to go. Okay, Zali. I prefer the former bloke who picked up a hose instead of somebody who picked up their phone at a time of national emergency. Your time will come, though. Less than 3 years now. Then there are the companies who felt that the Australian community had changed, that all of us demanded everything to be pulled out of the ground and all lights to be turned off. My favourite of all of these companies was this full-page ad that unsurprisingly ran in many newspapers at the height of the nonsense. It's from Tiffany & Co. Now, I love ladies called Tiffany, but the company called Tiffany & Co., what do they make? Oh, that's right. They sell silver frames and diamonds. They are the gift shop of the mining industry. Nothing they sell naturally occurs. It can only be achieved by digging things out of the ground. It can only be squeezed into place by emissions. And they want to tell us we've got to have climate action because they're guilty about what they do, which is to sell stuff that is only ever mined. Then the media, when it just got bored, tried to scare people. How's this for a couple of examples? Where apparently we had to move summer holidays now because these bushfires mean it's bad for everyone to go on holidays. And then my favourite beat up of the summer, how long will Australia be livable? Ooh. Are you scared yet? Will you vote Green yet? Would you say sorry for ever supporting anyone but the Greens? Channel 2 was off the chain. Now, Channel 2, largely at the local level, particularly the radio level, did very well, particularly their local coverage in Gippsland, despite the deletings that I mentioned a bit earlier, and the stuff that happened around South Australia and also on the South Coast. They deserve credit for that. At the local level, their radio coverage pretty freaking good. But the people who sit back in Canberra, well, they love that. Remember, they always said, and Laura Tingle in particular, who works over there at the 7:30 report, that the Labor victory was inevitable. So she has been mighty pissed off. There has been an awful lack of hazard reduction that's been happening in her worldview because this was the opportunity to go ScoMo. So despite the fact that there were people who understandably criticised the Prime Minister for taking a family holiday, and well, I think the majority of Australia understood that after being Prime Minister since August the previous year, it is okay to go on holidays. Whether Hawaii was the right one or not, that debate has been well fought. But what about how over the top Laura Tingle, among others, wanted to go in comparisons about how bad ScoMo's leadership was? What a surprise his news poll numbers fell when rubbish like this was being served up. That apparently this was Scott Morrison's Hurricane Katrina moment. You may remember Hurricane Katrina, of course, from the early 2000s when 1,200 people died. And people were being sexually assaulted and even murdered at evacuation centres. Yeah, that sounds like exactly what happened in Australia this bushfire season. They can't help themselves. But when the horses were off and running and nobody was pushing back, they were all trying to outdo themselves. Which brings us to the protests. There was a university student group who, by the way, had been campaigning against Scott Morrison and the government since March of last year, who had a whole series of organic and pop-up protests where people who have always hated the Prime Minister, who have always hated you for voting for him, or God forbid if you voted for Labor, it didn't give Greens your first preference. You know, classy people like this who hoped that the Prime Minister's house would burn down. Does that person know, by the way, that he lives in Kirribilli House. It's not his house, it's our house. But apparently all of these protests, well, they were all leading to a swell. And the swell apparently was that Australia demands climate action like what the Greens want. A blank cheque for Extinction Rebellion to decide how this country should respond to climate change. For those that are half listening, climate change exists. You can't have 7 billion people on the planet without something happening to it. But what do you do when you only produce 1 and a bit % of the entire pollution that is part of the problem? What do you do when you're a first world country? The point is, you sign Paris, you do your bit, but you can't do it all. Especially when China, who can continue to pollute at increased levels till 2030, are in the game. America is not in the game at all, let alone India and the rest. So, what did the polls show? The polls showed that, yes, there was a flip. And apparently, despite saying that an absolute seminal moment, climate change opinion is shifting, yes, there was a change in the polls. Labor is now the preferred party, apparently, when it comes to forming government, but that's what they said leading into the election. But it's this bit of the poll that nobody paid attention to last week. Well, we did. If Australia was at a tipping point where massive climate change action must happen and must happen now, so help us God. If Australia is no longer going to be livable, we need to move our summers, and apparently this was as bad as Hurricane Katrina. Why did the Greens vote only go up by 1 point? There has been no climate change revolution. The people who have always demanded that we turn our country into a national experiment so they can feel better when they fly on private jets to international conferences around the world, they just got loud again. They got silenced by the election because the quiet Australians said, you know what, 45% emissions reduction? Sorry, Labor, that's not what we're into. We're fine with the 27% emissions reduction that this government currently has because we believe climate change exists, but we also know that Australia is just but a little island and we can't do it all. And China would replace anything that we create. Do you get my point? If there was a revolution, it wouldn't have been the Labor Party that would have been the one that supposedly Australia wants to become the government. It would be the Greens. But unsurprisingly, that didn't happen. And one final whinge from the media towards the end of this bad summer, even when it started to rain, the Channel 9 newspapers were bitching and moaning. Apparently, according to this, drought-breaking rain likely to cause greenhouse emissions to rise. You can't win. If it doesn't rain, it's the end of the world. If it does rain, it's the end of the world. Okay. Now, Australian media and many people in Australia, you need a civics lesson. You can like or dislike ScoMo, but let's all hold hands and learn a lesson together. There are 3 levels of government in Australia. There is federal, there is state, there is local. Or if you'd like me to put it another way, there are soldiers, police, men and women, and garbage collectors. And under the Constitution, it has been somewhat agreed since the early 1900s that the people who have responsibility for emergency services in this country are the states. Now, have we got used to the idea that the government does send in money? Sure. Are we used to the idea that Prime Ministers, Liberal, Labor, this one, previous ones and ones into the future, turn up during disasters? Sure. But are they the ones who are individually responsible for whether enough hazard reduction took place? No. Instead, the media tried to make it all about ScoMo because what they were trying to do was to undo the election, was to go back and pretend that we were on the verge of a climate emergency. A climate emergency that meant we had to have a revolution. A revolution that, by the way, only saw a 1 point increase when it came to the Greens.